So in the previous video we have discussed about these two features of our designing while diving deep into the designing of URL shortener. One is data model and hash function. So in this video we will be looking into these two remaining. One is the URL shortening and another is URL redirection. So let's look into them individually, like what is URL shortening and how does it happen. So if we look into so in the previous video we discussed about the base62 conversion method, so we will be following that to generate our short URL. So let's look into a flow diagram and how this URL shortening happens, and we'll be getting a good picture of how does it work. So first we have an input, which is our long URL. First we will check long URL in DB or not. If it is in database, then return the short URL. If it is not, then first we generate a unique ID. After we generate a unique ID, what we do? We convert that ID to short URL. Here we use the base62 to convert UID to short URL. I have discussed in the previous video. You can have a look how we do actually. And now once this short URL is generated, we just save this ID, short URL and the long URL in the database. So let's look into an example of how this thing works, concrete example. For that we'll choose an URL and we'll work on it. So let's say this is my long URL which we want to shorten and put it into the database. So first we will check in the database whether this URL is already present or not. So first we look into the database, already present or not. If no, if yes, then return the short URL. If no, then we begin our process. First we generate a unique ID. Let's say in our case the unique ID is like something 1009 2156 74938. Okay, after this we do a base62 conversion to generate the short URL or hash value. Base62 conversion, it comes down to be ZN9EDCU. So once we have this hash value, we get our short URL. So let's say this is tinyurl.com/ZNEDCU. So finally we store in the database in a entry into database. So in database we have our ID, we have the short URL and we have the long URL. So instead of storing the entire URL, we only store the hash value because this is common for all. This is the domain name. So what we can do is we have the ID which is stored here. I'm not writing it again, it's huge. So ID is stored here, this ID. Then this is the short URL ZN9EDCU which is generated from this ID, and the corresponding long URL which is here is entered into here, and thus we get an entry in the database. And whenever in future if in case suppose we have this long URL again and we want to get a short URL, we want to form a short URL, we'll hit the database, we'll find this short URL is already present and we'll get back the short URL. So in this way URL shortening works. So we have to keep in mind also the unique ID that is generated in distributed systems. Unique ID generation is a important task, and for that you can also watch my playlist, design a unique ID generator. By the way, I have discussed various methods like multi-master replication, universal unique ID generator, ticket server and Twitter snowflake approach, all these methods to generate a unique ID. So you can choose among them which is favorable for your use case and generate a unique ID in a distributed system. So let's look into the last section of our video, which is the URL redirection. So by URL redirection means like we hit the short URL, it goes to the web server, which is the long URL, and the client ultimately moves to the original application. So how does all this thing happen? So like whenever a user, let's say a client, clicks on a short URL or enters a short URL, get API request is sent to the load balancer. Okay, so this is something like a tinyurl.com slash and something which we just generated. Let's use that only. Our ZN9EDCU. Yes, and the load balancer, what it does, it goes to the web server which is hosting the URL shortening service, checks in the database. So mind you, we also want this method to be very fast. For that we also use a cache also. So first it will check in the cache if that mapping is present. If it is present, then it's very fast and returns that entry from the cache to the client. If it is not present in the cache, then it looks into the database, it gets the long URL for the corresponding short URL, puts it in the cache if memory present, and then returns that long URL to the client. So first we do this. Second, the load balancer redirects the request to the web server hosting the URL shortening service. Then we check in the cache. If not present in the cache, check in the database, and if it is also not present in the database, then it's most probably an invalid short URL also, and then finally the long URL is being returned to the client. So in this way URL redirectioning happens. So it's very easy. We have discussed in all the previous videos also, so you now might have a clear idea of how a URL shortening happens, how a URL redirectioning happens. So in the end of the interview, you can also discuss with the interviewers some of the important features, like I can tell this like end of interview discussion. So here what we can do is, like we can suppose in a potential security issue, a malicious user send an overwhelming large number of URL shortening requests. So what we'll do in this case, suppose I have a scenario 1. Malicious user send a large number of URL requests to shorten in a short period of time. So an immediate solution which comes to our mind, if you can give it a thought also by pausing the video, is like we can use a rate limiter. And if you want to know more about in details how rate limiter works, you can check my video or playlist of designing of a rate limiter. The link for this video will be present in the description box. You can check it out. And what rate limiter can help us, it can filter out on basis of IP address the request. So this is an interesting point which we can discuss. Another is, we can suppose a huge number of valid requests comes and the load balancer redirects it, but the web servers are all busy. Since our web servers are stateless, we can add or remove web servers as we want depending on the load. So we have to make our web tier stateless. So this is also an interesting observation which we can discuss. Another is like database scaling, like horizontal scaling, sharding, and database replication. This is also necessary depending on the scalability of the short URLs or number of short URLs being generated. So this is like database replication. This is also a feature of availability or consistency. So these are basic features of a system architecture which we can discuss with the interviewer. And like sharding or horizontal scaling, or these things, sharding or horizontal scaling. So all these things which we can use. We can also, like we have also discussed in the first 2 videos of this playlist, like why do we actually use a short URL. One of the main purposes is like analytic purpose. Like if you remember the 302 request status response code which is being sent along with the long URL, analytic purpose, we can use it for analytic purpose, that 302 status response, that the long URL has been temporarily moved, the short URL has been moved to the long URL temporarily, like, and every time we make another long URL, short URL request to get a long URL, it will hit the short URL shortening service to get the long URL. So this can be used for analytic purpose also. So this is one of the feature which we can discuss. And another general feature is like availability or scalability or consistency. These are any core of any large system designing, and we can also discuss them about this with the interviewer. So by this we come to the end of this series of designing a URL shortener. Hope you liked this series, and please stay tuned for more such interesting videos. And thank you for watching this video. I'll see you in the next video.